What the seismologists, the geophysicists, the earthquake engineers, the tsunami warning center scientists, the United States Geological Survey researchers, and the broader community of earth scientists who have been analyzing the magnitude 7.3 earthquake that struck Mexico with the full power of their monitoring networks, their modeling systems, their accumulated scientific understanding of the tectonic architecture of the Pacific and North American plate boundary system, and the decades of research into how major seismi, CI events in one part of an interconnected geological system, can influence, trigger, or modify the stress conditions and the earthquake probability in other parts of the same system are now saying about whether and how the 7.3 magnitude earthquake that has just occurred in Mexico could affect California is information of genuine scientific importance and genuine practical urgency for the tens of millions of people living in California who are acutely aware of their own state's extraordinary earthquake vulnerability, who understand that California sits on one of the most seismically active tectonic boundaries on the surface of the earth, and who have been wondering since the moment the Mexico earthquake hit whether the shaking they may have felt or the news reports they are reading about a major seismic event to their south represents something that should change their assessment of their own immediate earthquake risk or prompt them to take preparedness actions they might not otherwise be taking at this particular moment in the ongoing seismic history of the Pacific Rim. The 7.3 magnitude earthquake that struck Mexico is itself an event of extraordinary destructive potential and extraordinary scientific significance, regardless of any implications it may or may not have for California's earthquake situation. Because a magnitude 7.3 earthquake releases an enormous quantity of energy, equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons of moderate yield detonating simultaneously in the Earth's crust, and is capable of causing catastrophic structural damage, significant casualties, widespread infrastructure disruption, and the full range of humanitarian consequences that major earthquakes produce when they occur beneath or near populated areas whose buildings, infrastructure, and emergency response systems may be inadequate to withstand the ground shaking, the ground deformation, the landslides, the liquefaction, and the tsunami generation potential that an earthquake of this magnitude can produce depending on the specific location, the specific depth, the specific fault mechanism, and the specific geological setting in which the earthquake occurs. The tectonic setting of the Mexico earthquake, the specific location within the complex plate boundary system, where the Cocos Plate, the Rivera Plate, the Pacific Plate, the North American Plate, and the Caribbean Plate interacted along a system of subduction zones, transform faults, and spreading centers that together constitute one of the most tectonically complex and most seismically active regions of the Western Hemisphere, is the essential context for understanding both the earthquake itself and its potential implications for the seismic situation in California. Because the tectonic connection between the seismic zone where this earthquake occurred and the tectonic system that drives earthquake hazard in California is a connection that operates through the large-scale plate motion system that links the entire Pacific Rim in a continuously evolving geological relationship, whose implications for how major earthquakes in one region affect the stress state and the seismic potential in connected regions have been the subject of sustained scientific research that has produced important but not yet conclusive findings about the nature and the magnitude of these teleseismic stress transfer effects. The specific scientific question of whether the Mexico 7.3 earthquake could affect California's earthquake hazard in the near term, whether it could trigger earthquakes on California fault systems through dynamic stress triggering from the seismic waves that the Mexico earthquake generated, through static stress transfer that permanently changes the stress conditions on California faults in ways that move some of them closer to failure, or through any other geophysical mechanism that connects a major seismic event in Mexico to the earthquake potential of the California fault systems that represent the primary seismic hazard for the state's population, is a question that the expert scientific community is addressing with careful nuance, with honest acknowledgement of the genuine uncertainties that characterize the current state of scientific knowledge about earthquake triggering and stress transfer at the regional scale, and with the combination of measured reassurance about the most catastrophic scenarios and sober acknowledgement of the genuine uncertainties that responsible scientific communication about earthquake hazard always requires. Dynamic stress triggering, the mechanism by which the seismic waves generated by a major earthquake travel outward from the epicenter and can temporarily increase the stress on fault systems they pass through in ways that, in some cases, produce triggered earthquakes in regions that the seismic waves are traversing, is a mechanism that has been documented in the scientific literature as a real phenomenon that has produced triggered seismicity in distant regions following major earthquakes, with some of the most extensively studied examples, including the triggering of small earthquakes across much of the western United States following major earthquakes in Alaska and elsewhere in the Pacific Rim, providing scientific evidence that seismic waves from large earthquakes can indeed influence the seismic activity of fault systems thousands of kilometers from the originating earthquake through the dynamic stress changes they produce as they pass through those fault systems. The crucial scientific qualification that the expert community is emphasizing in its assessment of dynamic stress triggering from the Mexico 7.3 earthquake's potential effects on California is that while dynamic triggering is a real and documented phenomenon, the earthquakes it produces are typically small, generally at or near the magnitude threshold of detectability by sensitive seismic networks, rather than the magnitude 6, 7, or greater events that would represent a significant seismic hazard to California's population and infrastructure. And that the temporary nature of dynamic stress changes means that any triggering effect lasts only for the duration of the passing seismic waves, rather than creating a persistent increase in earthquake probability that would justify long-term changes in preparedness posture or emergency management response, based solely on the dynamic triggering mechanism, statics stress transfer, the mechanism by which a major earthquake permanently changes the stress distribution in the surrounding crust by the amount that the earthquake rupture releases, accumulated elastic strain energy from the portion of the fault that ruptured, transferring that strain energy to the surrounding crust and to the adjacent portions of the fault system that did not rupture, potentially moving some portions of connected fault systems closer to the stress threshold at which they will rupture in subsequent earthquakes, is a mechanism whose effects are permanent rather than transient, and that operates over longer timescales than dynamic triggering, but whose geographic reach at the distances separating the Mexico earthquake. Epicenter from California's major fault systems is limited by the geometric and geological complexity of the plate boundary system, and by the distance over which significant static stress transfer can occur from a single earthquake rupture. The expert scientific consensus on the California implications of the Mexico 7.3 earthquake, as communicated by USGS seismologists, by academic researchers at California universities with expertise in earthquake seismology and fault mechanics, and by the operational seismologists at the earthquake monitoring centers that track seismic activity across the western United States in real time, reflects the current state of scientific knowledge about earthquake triggering and stress transfer, with appropriate acknowledgement of both what is known and what remains genuinely uncertain, confirming that some degree of dynamic stress interaction between the Mexico earthquake and California fault systems is physically certain through the passage of seismic waves from a magnitude 7.3 earthquake, while emphasizing that the probability of the Mexico earthquake triggering a large damaging earthquake on a major California fault system in the near term is not significantly elevated beyond the background probability that California earthquake hazard always represents, and that the state's residents and institutions need to be prepared for as a continuous feature of living in one of the most seismically active regions of the world. The background earthquake probability that California represents, even in the absence of any triggering effect from the Mexico 7.3 earthquake, is itself a probability of sufficient magnitude and sufficient imminence that the earthquake preparedness actions that Californians should be taking in response to this event are the same earthquake. Preparedness actions they should already have been taking as residents of a state where the question of when the next major earthquake will occur is not if, but when. Where the fault systems capable of producing magnitude 7 and greater earthquakes exist throughout the state and in close proximity to every major urban center, and where the historical and geological record documents a pattern of major seismic events whose recurrence, interval for the largest possible events on the state's most dangerous fault systems, has in some cases already been exceeded, meaning that the expected time of the next major earthquake on some California fault systems is now rather than sometime in the future. The San Andreas Fault, the master fault that defines the boundary between the Pacific and North American plates along much of California's length, and that is capable of producing earthquakes in the magnitude 7.8 to 8.0 range. That would be far more destructive and far more consequential for California's population and infrastructure than any plausible triggered earthquake from the Mexico 7.3 event, has been the subject of decades of scientific research that has established with high confidence that a major earthquake on the southern section of the fault, which has not produced a great earthquake since 1857, represents one of the highest probability major earthquake scenarios in the United States, and one whose eventual occurrence is a geological certainty whose timing cannot be predicted with precision, but whose imminence in the geological sense is well established by the accumulated strain that has been building on this locked fault section since its last great rupture. The Hayward Fault in the San Francisco Bay Area, described by some seismologists as one of the most dangerous urban faults in the United States because of its location running directly through densely populated communities and beneath critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, water system components, transportation corridors, and the full range of urban infrastructure that a magnitude 6.8 to 7.0 earthquake on this fault would severely damage or destroy, similarly represents a major area of components, transportation corridors, and the full range of urban infrastructure that a magnitude 6.8 to 7.0 earthquake on this fault would severely damage or destroy, similarly, represents a major earthquake hazard that exists entirely independently of any triggered effect from the Mexico 7.3 earthquake, and that the expert community has been warning California residents and California institutions to prepare for with the same urgency, regardless of what any particular earthquake event in the broader region may or may not mean for its near-term probability. The practical preparedness actions that California residents should take in response to the expert assessment of the Mexico 7.3 earthquake's implications for their own seismic situation begin with the recognition that the correct response to a major earthquake anywhere in the Pacific Rim is not panic about imminent catastrophic triggering, but renewed commitment to the earthquake preparedness measures that reduce the consequences of the major California earthquake that will occur at some point regardless of any triggered effects from the Mexico event, and that the expert community's message that the Mexico earthquake does not dramatically change the near-term probability of a major California earthquake is not reassurance that no preparedness action is needed, but rather confirmation that the preparedness actions that were urgently needed before the Mexico earthquake are exactly as urgently needed after it. Assembling or updating the earthquake preparedness supplies, including water, food, medications, first aid materials, and emergency equipment that a household needs to be self-sufficient for a minimum of 72 hours, and ideally for 2 weeks following a major earthquake when normal. Supply chains may be disrupted and emergency services may be overwhelmed, represents the most immediately actionable and most practically important preparedness step that California residents can take in response to the expert discussion of the Mexico earthquake's California implications. Because the most important determinant of how a household experiences a major earthquake is not the earthquake itself, but the degree of preparation that was in place before it struck. Reviewing the seismic vulnerability of the home, identifying whether the structure type, the foundation system, the construction era, and the local soil conditions create earthquake vulnerability that retrofitting could reduce, understanding what the building is likely to do in a major earthquake, and making the specific structural improvements that engineering assessment recommends as the most cost-effective measures for reducing earthquake damage is a preparedness investment, whose importance the expert discussion of the Mexico earthquake's California implications underscores by reminding California residents that the earthquake they need to prepare for is not a hypothetical future event, but a geological certainty whose consequences will be shaped most significantly by the preparedness investments that were made before it happened. What the experts are saying about whether the 7.3 Mexico earthquake could affect California is a message that deserves to be heard in its full nuance, acknowledging the genuine geophysical connections between major earthquakes across the Pacific Rim, while providing accurate and honest context about what those connections mean for the near-term earthquake probability that California residents face, and about the preparedness, actions that appropriately respond to that probability, regardless of any specific triggering event. Because the most important thing that Californians can take from the expert discussion of the Mexico earthquake's implications is not false reassurance that the triggering probability is low, but renewed urgency about the preparedness that the continuously high background earthquake probability of living in California has always demanded, and that no expert assessment of any individual triggering event can ever substitute for or reduce the need for. Like this video, if this complete, scientifically grounded, and practically important analysis of what experts are saying about whether the 7.3 Mexico earthquake could affect California gave you the accurate, nuanced, and actionable understanding of both the geophysical connections between this event and California's seismic situation, and the preparedness steps that the expert discussion of those connections reinforces the urgency of subscribe to this channel for the kind of serious, scientifically informed, and genuinely protective earthquake and natural hazard coverage that California residents and everyone else living in seismically active regions deserve to have access to when major earthquake events occur in their region, and generate the questions about implications and preparedness that expert scientific communication should address honestly, i.e. completely, and with the practical guidance that transforms scientific understanding into protective action. And tell me in the comments where in California you're located, whether you felt the Mexico earthquake, and what earthquake preparedness steps you're taking in response to the expert discussion of what this major seismic event means for the ongoing earthquake hazard that you and every other Californian live with every single day. See you in the next one.